The Admiral's voice cut through the tense silence of the dining room, clear and authoritative from the television screen. "And I'll tell you, Samir, your father was a legend. But he'd be most proud of Dr. Sharma. Her work on the Crimson Cipher is already required reading at Annapolis. In fact, we have the same call sign for her that he once had, Enigma." My father's face was pale, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at the screen. For a moment, I thought he might not be breathing. He finally turned his head and looked at me, but for the first time in my life, he didn't see his disappointing daughter. He saw a ghost, but that single, shattering moment of recognition was earned. It was forged in the cold fire of an insult delivered just 1 month earlier, in a place that smelled of old paper and quiet grief. We were all gathered in a sterile lawyer's office for the reading of the will of my grandfather. Commander Dev Sharma, a decorated Navy SEAL, who was more of a legend than a family member. I sat there quietly, a ghost in a different way, an invisible observer to my own family's well-rehearsed play. At the head of the table sat my father, Colonel Samir Sharma, a man whose rigid posture screamed a lifetime of career infantry. He saw the world in terms of strength and command, 2 things he never saw in me. Beside him was my older brother, Raj, the family's clear golden child, a slick corporate lawyer who treated every conversation like a cross-examination he was destined to win. And then there was me, Anya, the quiet daughter with a hobby job and the PhD he called a piece of paper. The lawyer droned on, his voice a flat line as he carved up a life into assets and beneficiaries. "To my son, Samir, I leave the ranch and the vintage Mustang." My father nodded, a king accepting his rightful due. "To my grandson, Raj, a significant trust fund." Raj flashed a quick, predatory smile. It wasn't just about the money or the car. It was the familiar weight of the scales tipping, just as they always had. It was the echo of 10 years of money is tight, while Raj's tuition was paid without question. The busted laptop, I had to replace myself. All of it played out in a single, hollow moment. Then, the lawyer cleared his throat and looked at me over his spectacles. "To my granddaughter, Anya, I bequeath the entire contents of storage unit 1138 at Securite Self-Storage." The words hung in the air. A smirk crept across Raj's face. My father let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. In the hallway afterward, he clapped me on the shoulder, his pity a physical, suffocating weight. "Guess your grandpa knew who the real man in the family is," he said, his voice laced with that familiar, condescending chuckle. "Don't worry, Annie. We'll help you clear out the old junk." A cold fury, quiet and precise, settled deep in my bones. He thought it was a joke. He called me Annie the Archivist because I had a PhD and worked for the government. He thought I filed papers. He had a pathetic little box for me. What he didn't know was that my filing was parsing classified signals intelligence that stopped wars before they began. To understand the reckoning that was coming, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. Living 2 lives means you get very, very good at building walls. In one world, I was a person of substance, of authority. In the other, I was just Annie, and Annie's world was a loud, suffocating place, usually smelling of charcoal and cheap beer. I remember one summer barbecue, the heat clinging to everyone's skin. My father raising a bottle and a toast. My brother Raj stood there soaking in the praise, having just closed some brutal hostile takeover deal at his law firm. He was grinning, the conquering hero returned from corporate war. "That's my boy," my father boomed, his voice thick with pride. "A fighter, just like his old man. He sees what he wants, and he takes it." Everyone cheered, a chorus of validation for the family's chosen son. Later, when there was a lull, I tried to find a crack to slide my own news into. My hands felt clammy, as I mentioned, my voice barely above the backyard chatter. that my doctoral thesis had just been published in a major academic journal. My father turned, his focus momentarily shifting from Raj. He gave me that familiar, placating smile, the one reserved for a child showing off a clumsy drawing. "That's nice, honey," he said, patting my head. "Any pictures in it?" Before I could even answer, Raj chimed in from across the patio. "Unless it's a code for a bigger salary, who cares?" The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate. It wasn't just a joke. It was a verdict. In their world, value was loud, tangible, and preferably aggressive. My quiet intellectual achievements were a hobby, a curiosity, the quaint little projects of Annie the archivist. I just stood there, a ghost at their feast, feeling the familiar, cold weight of being fundamentally misunderstood. My other world couldn't have been more different. It was a place of absolute silence, of cold, recycled air, and of secrets that held the world's balance in their grasp. It was a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility at Fort Meade. There were no barbecues here, no loud boasts. There was only the quiet hum of servers and the immense, crushing weight of responsibility. I stood before a wall of monitors, a waterfall of cascading code that looked like nonsense to anyone else, but to me, it was a conversation. My eyes scanned the lines, catching something almost imperceptible. A flicker. In the pattern, a digital whisper where there should have been silence. That's when my superior approached, his presence a quiet authority in the sterile room. He was EPT Director Evans, a sharp, no-nonsense senior NSA official Führer who measured a person's worth not by the volume of their voice, but by the precision of their thoughts. He stood beside me, his eyes following mine to the screen. "What have you got, Doctor?" he asked, his voice low. I pointed to the anomaly. "The polymorphic encryption is masking a null cipher sequence," I explained, the jargon a second language to me. "It's not noise, it's a dead drop signal. They're activating the cell. We have to push the crimson cipher decrypt now, or we lose the window." I could feel the eyes of my team on my back. The air grew thick with tension. The lives of people we'd never meet hung on this single decision. Director Evans looked from the screen to me, his expression unreadable. He gave a single curt nod. "Make the call, Doctor." There was no hesitation. No second guessing. In that room, my word was final. My intellect was a weapon, and my judgment was trusted implicitly. I gave the command, and my team moved with silent, focused efficiency. It was in these moments, under the weight of immense consequence, that I felt most myself. I was not Annie the archivist. I was a cryptanalyst. I was a shield. I was the person my grandfather always knew I could be. He was the only one who had ever been able to see both worlds at once, because he had lived in them too. I remembered being a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on the floor of his study, completely stumped by a complex puzzle he'd given me. I was frustrated, on the verge of tears, ready to sweep the pieces off the board. My grandfather, Dev, sat down on the floor next to me. He didn't offer a solution, or point out the next move. He just watched me for a moment, his eyes kind. "Don't look at the pieces, little enigma," he said softly, his voice a warm, steady anchor. "Everyone sees the pieces. You need to look at the patterns between them. That's where the secrets are." He tapped my forehead gently. "Wars aren't won by the man with the biggest gun, but by the one who reads the map when everyone else is completely lost." He saw the analyst in me before I even knew the word. He saw my mind not as a liability or a strange hobby, but as the sharpest tool in the box. He saw me. My family only respected the language of force and money. For years I tried to make them understand my world. After the will reading, I realized I had it backwards. It was time to use the rules of my world, protocol, evidence, and undeniable authority, to make them understand theirs. The key felt cold in my hand as I drove to the storage facility. The address led me to a row of identical, rust-streaked metal doors baking in the sun. Unit 1001-138. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. With a groan of protest, the corrugated door rolled up, revealing a dark space thick with the smell of dust and old paper. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on old footlockers, dusty, medals in glass cases, and stacks of neatly labeled metal file boxes. It wasn't junk. It was an archive. My grandfather had left me a library of his life. I started with a heavy, locked footlocker. Inside, beneath perfectly preserved dress uniforms, were the files. They weren't just service records. They were unredacted after-action reports, personal mission logs, and letters. The pages were filled with acronyms I knew from my own work. SIGINT, COMINT, OPSEC. A shocking clarity began to form in my mind. My grandfather, the man my father worshipped as a frontline warrior. He was one of us. He was an intelligence operator, a pioneer in the very field I now worked in. He wasn't just the tip of the spear. He was the mind that aimed it. Then I found it. A thick file labeled simply, Operation Nightshade. I knew the story, of course. It was my father's favorite. A legendary combat victory. But my grandfather's private logs told a different story, a secret history. He had broken an enemy communication code, allowing his team to preempt a devastating ambush, saving hundreds of lives without firing a single shot. The Public Medal for Valor. It was a cover story. Tucked inside the file was a sealed envelope. On it, in his familiar script, were 3 words, "My little enigma." My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a letter, explaining everything. He said he was leaving this for me, because he knew only I would have the clearance and the intellect to understand his true legacy. The last line was a directive. If they ever doubt you, find my old friend, Admiral Thompson. He knows the truth. Back in my apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of my grandfather's real life, I didn't cry. The time for feeling hurt was over. A cold, crystalline purpose settled over me. This was no longer a family drama. It was an intelligence operation. The objective: to correct a flawed narrative with irrefutable proof. I powered up my secure laptop and began my work. Using the resources at my disposal, I located the man from the letter. Admiral Thompson, now the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. The trap began to take shape, piece by piece. I drafted a formal email, my fingers moving with precision across the keyboard. It was a professional inquiry, a request to verify historical service records for the official archives. There was no emotion, only protocol. The Admiral's office replied within the hour, agreeing to a secure video conference. Everything was set. My father was planning a big family dinner to celebrate his own retirement anniversary. He'd sent a group text reminding everyone to come prepared with a story about a real warrior. I replied with a simple confirmation. He had no idea I was about to introduce him to 2 of them. The air in my father's house was thick with the scent of roasted meat and self-congratulation. It was his retirement anniversary, and he was holding court at the head of the dining table, a king in his castle. The room was filled with relatives, their faces upturned and adoring as he spun his favorite tales of his time in the infantry. He was a master storyteller. I had to give him that. Every story grew more heroic with each telling, the stakes higher, his actions more decisive. My brother Raj sat to his right, playing the part of the proud heir, laughing at the right moments and adding his own commentary about his battles in the courtroom, as if a hostile negotiation was the same as a firefight. I remained silent, a spectator at my own family gathering, nursing a glass of water and observing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was a strategist, watching the terrain before the engagement began. He was in the middle of a particularly grand story, one involving a lone, patrol and impossible odds. When he paused for a dramatic sip of wine, the room was rapt. That was my opening. I set my glass down with a soft click, a sound that seemed to cut through the boisterous atmosphere. "I've been going through Grandpa Dev's things," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying across the table. All eyes turned to me, surprised I had spoken at all. "Did you know his Medal of Valor from Operation Nightshade wasn't for combat at all?" My father's smile tightened. He put his glass down and let out a short, dismissive scoff. It was a sound I knew well. It was the sound of my thoughts and opinions being packed into a small box and set aside. "Annie, please," he said. "The use of my childhood nickname a deliberate tool to diminish me. Don't start with your conspiracy theories. Your grandfather was a hero, a trigger puller. The best there was." He waved his hand, ready to move on, to return to his audience. But I didn't let him. I held his gaze. I had the facts on my side. For the first time in my life, I had something he couldn't simply dismiss with a condescending laugh. "According to his own after-action reports," I continued, my voice steady. As I pulled my tablet from my bag, the operation was a SIGINT victory. He decrypted enemy communications and prevented an ambush before it ever happened. I looked directly at him, laying the final piece of evidence on the table. "He was a codebreaker, Dad. Just like me." That was the line he couldn't tolerate. The comparison, the idea that my quiet work behind a screen could possibly be in the same universe as his father's supposed heroism, it was anathema to him. His face darkened with a surge of anger. "How dare you?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You sit at your desk all day, playing with your little puzzles, and you dare to reinterpret the life of a real warrior? You are disrespecting his memory." The room had gone completely still, the air crackling with the tension no one had expected. They all looked at me, waiting for me to shrink, to apologize, to retreat as I always had. But my hands were steady on the tablet. My heart was calm. I had planned for this. "I thought you might say that," I said, my voice still level, a stark contrast to his rising fury. "So, I asked a primary source to confirm." I turned the tablet, tapped the screen, and the device connected seamlessly to the large television on the dining room wall. The screen flickered to life, and the face of a man in a decorated, 4-star admiral's uniform filled the room. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the sound of my father's sharp, involuntary intake of breath. He recognized the rank, and the face, instantly. His entire posture changed. The slouching, pontificating patriarch was gone, replaced in a flash by the rigid form of a colonel who has just come face to face with a superior officer. The admiral on the screen nodded crisply. "Colonel Sharma." His voice was gravelly, authoritative, and held the weight of command. "Dr. Sharma asked me to clarify some details about her grandfather's service record, specifically Operation Nightshade." My father could only stare, speechless. The admiral continued, his gaze unwavering. "Your father was a hero, Samir, but not for the reasons you tell your stories. He saved my life and the lives of my entire platoon that day. Not with a rifle, but with his brain. He broke a code we all thought was unbreakable. His intellect was his greatest weapon." The admiral paused, letting the words sink into the stunned silence of the room. He then turned his gaze slightly, as if looking right at me through the camera. Then came the final, devastating salvo. "And I'll tell you, Samir," the admiral said, his voice softening with a note of profound respect. "He'd be most proud of Dr. Sharma. Her work on the Crimson Cipher is already required reading at Annapolis. In fact, we have the same call sign for her that he once had, Enigma. The bravado, the anger, the lifetime of carefully constructed superiority. It all drained from my father's face, leaving behind the pale, slack-jawed visage of a man whose entire worldview had just been publicly and irrefutably dismantled. He was no longer looking at his daughter. He was looking at a person who held a rank in a world he understood that he could never, ever achieve. My father had spent my entire life lecturing me on the chain of command. In the end, he was rendered speechless by a truth he couldn't possibly overrule. The Admiral's face vanished from the screen, replaced by a silent black void. In the dining room, the silence he left behind was heavier and more absolute than anything I had ever experienced. It was a physical presence, pressing down on all of us. No one moved. No one spoke. My uncle dropped his fork, and the clatter against his plate sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I looked at my brother Raj. For the first time in his life, the slick, confident lawyer was gone. He was just a man staring intently at his mashed potatoes, as if they held the answers to a question he was too afraid to ask. He couldn't look at me, and he couldn't look at our father. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. There was no desire to gloat or to drive the point home. The mission was complete. The record was corrected. Anything more would have been unnecessary. With deliberate, quiet movements, I disconnected my tablet and slid it back into my bag. I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the hardwood floor. I looked around at the stunned faces of my family, these people who had only ever seen a caricature of me. I gave them a single, small nod, a gesture of finality, not of reconciliation. And then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them behind in the deafening silence of a truth they could no longer ignore. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been fundamentally and permanently rewritten. That night was not an ending, but a beginning. The 6 months that followed were a quiet revolution. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been the background noise of my entire life. It just faded away. I no longer braced for the next dismissive comment, the next condescending pat on the head. The space that anxiety had occupied in my mind was now free, filled instead with focus, with clarity, with the quiet confidence that comes from no longer having to justify your own existence. I was no longer Annie the archivist, a person defined by my family's limited imagination. I was Dr. Anya Sharma, a name that carried weight in rooms my father didn't even know existed. My new world was a briefing room at the NSA, a place that felt more like home than my childhood house ever had. I stood at the head of a conference table, leading my own team of analysts through a complex threat assessment. The room was filled with some of the sharpest minds in the country, and their eyes were on me, their attention absolute. They didn't see a quiet daughter or an awkward niece. They saw their project lead. They listened intently. They challenged my assumptions with respect. They offered their own insights with a collaborative spirit I had never experienced before. This was a family forged not by blood, but by mutual trust and proven competence. Here, my intellect wasn't a strange hobby. It was the most valuable asset in the room. One afternoon, back in my office, an email popped up in my inbox. The sender's name made my breath catch for just a second. Samir Sharma. The subject line was a single word. Anya. For a long moment, I just stared at it, a relic from a past life that had found its way into my present. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet curiosity. I finally clicked it open. It wasn't the rambling, self-justifying apology I might have once expected. It was short, formal, and carried the unfamiliar tone of humility. He wrote that he had spent months thinking about that night, and about his father. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had built a legacy for my grandfather out of his own biases, not out of truth. He wrote, "Your grandfather was a great man because of his mind. You have honored him, and your work is more important than I ever could have understood. I am proud of you." I read the words over, twice. The person I was 6 months ago would have cried. She would have felt a lifetime of pain and longing, finally answered. but I felt a quiet sense of closure. It was like confirming a final piece of data, a variable that had been missing for years. His validation was no longer the objective. My own peace was. His apology wasn't a key that unlocked my happiness, but simply a postscript to a story that I had already finished writing. I moved the cursor over the email, clicked, and dragged it into a folder I had labeled Archive. Then I turned back to the classified report on my screen, the real work, my work. On my desk, a small framed photo caught my eye. Me as a child, sitting with my grandpa Dev, both of us hunched over a complex puzzle, smiling. My father believed a legacy was something you inherit. My grandfather taught me that a true legacy is written in a language only the worthy can decipher.